All right, we are right at the top of the hour, so we will get started on time here. Um, Welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good morning if you're on the West Coast, or good evening if you are joining this and are watching it at a later date and time. Thank you for joining us in our series of webinars here. We are fortunate and blessed to have Dr. Nathan Grawe back and doing another session for us around turning demographics into strategy, admissions and financial aid. A quick note about us. DegreeSite was really created as an organization by myself as a senior VP of enrollment and my co-founder as a technologist to really help increase access to higher education by getting students more immediate answers around transfer credits and evaluations. But enough about us. I want to introduce Dr. Nathan Grawe. He's a professor of economics at Carleton College, where he's served on the faculty since 1999. He's earned his BA from St. Olaf College and his master's and PhD in economics from University of Chicago. His work as a labor economist studies the connections between family background and educational and labor market outcomes. His books, The Demographics and Demand for Higher Education and The Agile College, have been extremely well read in our industry and have become staples of my daily work here. So, Dr. Groth, thank you again so much for joining us, and appreciate you spending some more time with us and our audience.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. As Drew mentioned, I've been a faculty member for over 25 years now. But in this last decade, as my research has taken me closer to the work of admissions folks, I've really come to appreciate the importance of all that you do so that people like me can just walk into a classroom and we have students there that are interesting and fun to teach. So thank you all for that. There was a session, a part one, a session one to this, and I understand that you can go back and watch that. But I'm just going to start with a little bit of introduction to some of the content of that, just so that we've got some context before we push into kind of what next or how do we respond. So the challenges that we face as we look forward are really multiple. One of them has to do with declining numbers of young people. So starting in 2008, we saw a decline in the number of births in the United States. We're seeing currently levels that we haven't seen since 1980. We're off by about 17% from the peak in 2007. And of course, we're a future-oriented industry. That's a blessing in many ways. It means we've got 18 years head start to think about this, but we've now been thinking about it for 18 years. And so that brings us to, 2007 was the peak births. Those young people reached age 18 in the last year or so, graduated high school. And so we're now sitting kind of at that peak cohort domestically, peering forward into year after year, basically, of contraction. So we've got a restricting pool. We can see this in Wikidata. So for instance, here's from their website, the projections by state of how many high school graduates will be produced by each state. Nationally, they're looking down 10% from 2025 to 2041. But you can see that there's a regional component here. So because of migrations out of the Northeast and the West Coast toward the South and the Southwest, kind of that South Atlantic region is a little bit stronger. Texas is a bit stronger. We've also had some other migration patterns toward the Dakotas and Montana, Idaho. But the rest of the country, we've got a lot of red here. And it's not just a little red. When we see in New York projection of loss of more than a quarter of high school graduates in the next decade or two, and in California, more than a quarter, and in Illinois, almost a third. We're looking at some really significant contractions. It's not just, however, that we're seeing a decline in the numbers, though we are, and this is going to be a challenge, but it's also who's in that pool. And so here again is Wikidata broken down now by regions, and you can see by race and ethnicity. And so everywhere we look, we see declining numbers of young people graduating from high school who identify as white or black. In most parts of the country, the Hispanic numbers and the Asian American numbers are on the rise, that you can see in the Northeast, declining numbers of Asians, and in the West, both Asians and Hispanics are expected to be in decline between 2025 and 2040. And so we've got a regional component to this, we've got a decline in the number, and then we've got this shift in the composition where higher ed has certainly seen a dramatic shift in who goes to college since the year 2000. But we are going to see more shifts in terms of this composition. And if we haven't really reckoned with how we fully, successfully integrate these students into our campus and support them to their definition of student success, we've got to get it figured out in the years to come. So demographics are challenging, but that's not the only challenge we're facing. We're also seeing declines in matriculation rates. So here we've got data from the CPS, the Current Population Survey, and we can see among recent high school grads ages 16 to 24, we used to have about 70% of such people immediately go on to a post-secondary institution the subsequent fall. But now it's down closer to 60 to 62%. And so we talked last time a little bit about different forces causing this. We've got political forces, we've got economic forces. So we're looking at fewer young people going to college, even as we are on the precipice of having declining cohorts. In addition, I think it's worth stepping back. There's a publication, I think it came out last week in Education Next, pointing out that higher ed has really grown up in 60 years of expanding enrollments. And when we think about the context then of what a decline in enrollment might mean financially for institutions, we really come to see the importance of the work that you all do and the questions we're raising here. And when we say that institutions are tuition dependent, it really means they're dependent on tuition. That's what those words mean, and it's not a joke. I think because most of us, all of us, grew up in this time period of expanding enrollments, we could recognize. You could just look at your revenue pie charts that yeah, we get most of our revenue from tuition, but not fully comprehend what would it mean if those tuition dollars started to go away because we saw declining enrollments. And so this Education Next piece by Stephen Schulman and Michael Horn looked at a number of colleges that here we're just looking at 44 schools in the Northeast, though they repeated the analysis with schools out west and they found something pretty similar. That if you just look at the amount of cash on hand and quasi-endowment and you think about, well, what would happen if we saw a modest 5 or a 10% decline in new enrollments? Well, it could be really, really destabilizing. You go from, so they're basically asking the question of how many institutions have resources where they could last at least 10 years with those kinds of declines with quote unquote business as usual. So we're just going to keep spending the way we've been spending, but we see lower tuition revenue. And if we maintain enrollments, most of these schools are in a place where they could hold out for a long while. But even a modest 5%, persistent 5% decline in enrollments, and all of a sudden we're talking about 1/3 of the institutions simply run out of money in less than a decade. Um, they also looked at the analysis without the quasi-endowment. What if you just look at cash on hand and then an alarming number are running out in less than 3 years? If you have a 10% decline in enrollment, then it's fully half of these institutions are all of a sudden existential trouble. They literally cannot stay afloat in less than a decade. And so business as usual clearly is not something that we can move forward with. And that's sort of where we sit right now. We're in an industry that has been really, really strong for many decades, but now we have multiple forces that suggest that we have some weakness on the enrollment side, and maybe our past practices, past business practices, past retention practices, past curriculum practices aren't going to serve us well going forward.
Okay. Well, I think you've painted a pretty good picture of some of the challenges ahead of us. We have more institutions, more competition, less high school graduates, radically changing demographics. What are some of the ways we can address this? And everyone, please continue to submit your questions in the Q&A, and we'll make sure we address them here at the end of the presentation. So let's just start thinking more positively now. What are we doing to
Yeah.
address these things? And Dr. Grawe, let me also say thank you for your comment about admissions people and the enrollment work. That's a wonderful thing to hear from a faculty member, and we definitely appreciate it.
Yeah, well, and thank you for the transition to the upside, or at least the more positive note. I think it's so critical when we face these challenges to recognize that they're real, but at the same time, we don't want to then give up our sense of agency. We have to recognize we do have levers we can pull. And I'm going to start by talking about levers that are directly in the control of the admissions office. But you'll see ultimately, my conclusion is that's probably not going to be enough. And so while I fervently hope that admissions officers are on their A games, I think we need to think more expansively than that. I was at a College Board young admission professionals professional development meeting not too many years ago. And the question was raised as your campus is thinking about demographic change and contraction, how many of you is the admissions office sort of plan A, B, and C? This is how we're going to address this challenge. Most of the hands went up. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that in the past, in a pretty forgiving environment where total enrollments were growing in general, when we had little blips, institutions could just lean on their admissions offices and say, help us out, bring us a few more students. And so I will start there, but we're going to see that it probably is not a strategy that fits the time period we're in. So the first place we might look if we have a weakening domestic market would be someplace else. So we could look at international students. Here, focusing on the light blue line, we can see the number of new international students enrolling as undergraduates. So this data is coming from the Open Doors initiative. We can see that since the fall of 2016-17, we've had a persistent decline in the number of new international students enrolling in undergraduate programs. We see the big decline of COVID, and we see a partial recovery after that. Though to be honest, that partial recovery shouldn't have been terribly surprising. Basically, what we've done is to return back to the trend that we were already on for a number of years prior to COVID. I think we should note that that decline in COVID here it was actually worse than what we see here because these numbers include students who were physically still in their home country but studying online with us. And of course, that might have been the best we could do, but it did mean that institutions didn't get that additional revenue that they might have hoped for from the students being on campus. But in any case, we're seeing this decline. Now, why are we seeing this decline? I think there's a lot of focus right now on Trump administration policies, and certainly the Trump administration has made it harder in a lot of ways to recruit international students and get visas and so on. But it's worth noting that the decline doesn't seem to have sped up when we went to a Trump administration from the Obama administration. It doesn't seem to have eased during the Biden administration. That's harder to see because of the COVID mess in the middle. And the timing of the decline starts before we got to the Trump administration. So those students who were showing up in smaller numbers in the fall of 2016, they were making their college matriculation decisions when pretty much everyone knew we were going to have a Clinton administration after the Obama administration. I point that out not to say that the Trump administration policies haven't been challenging, but rather to note that there are other factors that also make this a difficult market. We are seeing more competition from abroad. Canada, the UK, Australia, Canada recently has pulled back a bit, so that maybe provides us a little bit better opportunity. But all of this is to say, if we want to go into the international student market, I think some institutions will find their way through domestic weakness with more international students. But it's not simply flipping a light switch. It's not as if we just go over there and say, well, now we will take more of you, and all of a sudden problem solved. India and China themselves are building institutions modeled on ours because they aren't content to simply send us so many students every year. So we're going to have to work for it. It's a potential place where we might look to shore up weakness through the admissions office to boost enrollments, but we're going to have a clear strategy and we're going to have to work hard for it. We might also look to new domestic student groups. So I mentioned that even as we're experiencing this contraction, we're seeing a shift in the composition away from white and black students toward Asian to some degree and definitely toward Hispanics in a larger degree. So that might mean that we look to recruit in different high schools or different regions of the country, depending on what kind of regional or national market your institution holds. As we do so, though, just as with the international market, I think we need to remember that we have to work for it. Obviously, to bring students to a new campus requires work in the admissions office, but I'm also thinking about the work that we do once the students are on campus. So here, Pam Ettinger is talking about transforming her institution, Bunker Hill Community College, into an adult serving institution instead of serving traditional age students. She initiated a process where they looked at every single part of their campus from the admissions and orientation process all the way through to when classes meet and what's the academic schedule through the eyes of a non-traditional student. So she gave one example in a conversation we had where it was required that students be physically on campus for 2 different days before they were allowed to register for classes. She said this orientation included material that was obviously of critical importance. It's not that we didn't need to do orientation, but the manner of the orientation was well suited for an 18-year-old, not so well suited for a non-traditional student who has a job and kids and other obligations. And so thinking through how do we transform our institutions takes intentionality and it takes professional development. Even in the classroom here, she's talking about the natural response that many people, both staff and faculty, come up with was, why aren't you bringing me the right students? What's wrong with students today? By which most of us faculty and staff simply mean, you admissions folks aren't bringing us the same students you brought me 10 years ago. What's wrong with you all in admissions? Well, she points out, unless you're providing resources for professional development, it's going to be difficult. I mean, it's pretty natural that many people are going to go to this, why are we changing? But to get beyond that, why aren't you bringing students towards something more productive, requires that we have intentional conversations about who are these students? What assets do they bring to my classroom that previous students didn't bring? How can I change the way I teach to tap into these new assets? Okay, now what challenges or limitations do these students bring that previous students didn't bring? And how do I need to adapt the way I teach, change the way my classroom runs in order to acknowledge and make good on the promises that we made when we recruited these students? I think some of these things can be done in the context of admissions, but example suggests, I think if we try to recruit new students without engaging the rest of the campus, we're going to be in trouble. Some of this is just simple math. If we have a 17% decline in the size of the cohorts of young people, and we see a commensurate decline in the numbers on in our market that are graduating from high school, I don't think it's possible that we are just going to recruit our way out of it. The matriculation rate would have to go up to something like 75% from a current rate of about 62% in order for the admissions department alone to address what we're talking about. And that's not realistic. And so I think admissions professionals will have to get better at building partnerships with the rest of the campus. And that speaks to this, it's going to be initiating conversations that sometimes come down to inviting the campus, asking the campus to consider a new self-identity. So here's just one example of that. So Drake University in Iowa recognized that there were some students who they couldn't really serve because the best path for these students was to start at a two-year college, and Drake had no two-year programs. So one option, I suppose, would have been to partner with a local two-year campus and see if we could get a transfer, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But another possibility is to bring that kind of work in-house, and that's what Drake ultimately decided to do. They added an associate's program, and so students could come to Drake, start in a two-year program that was better suited for them, and then transfer into the four-year program. And as I think about that, it's not that I think every campus should be thinking about adding two-year programs. Some should. I think my own campus, that it's not a great fit for our mission. So it's not the specifics, but rather it's the attitude that I see at Drake. I know from being a faculty member at a four-year institution how challenging such a discussion must have been. The suggestion that, well, why don't we offer two-year degree programs speaks to some identity aspects that I have as a faculty member, that staff have, and yet the university here was willing to initiate that conversation. They were willing to say, who are our prospective students? Who do our new students need to be? And how might we, as an institution, need to change who we are so that we can meet students where they're at, rather than demanding that the students figure out how to transform themselves to meet us where we are at. I think this requires a lot of leadership that transcends, obviously, the admissions function, because it means asking, what is our core mission? And then having a laser focus on that so that we can separate wants from true mission critical components. There's some aspects of our mission that are just absolutely core and we shouldn't touch, but there are often a lot of other things layered on, sacred cows of we can't do this and we must do that limit our conversations and make it difficult for us to address a challenge like the one we're facing. I think there's also a clear connection in our work here to what's going on in financial aid. I think it's important to recognize the influence of sticker price. So whether we think about the Go Blue Guarantee, where Michigan families with incomes $125,000 and below and assets of $125,000 or less now qualify for free tuition. And the key word there is free. So there's work by Tim Kaine at Harvard that's a few decades old now that actually looked at students who were Pell eligible. So these students clearly are high need students. Clearly, the sticker price of college should not matter to them. And the question that he posed was, if we reduce the sticker price by $1,000 or we increase aid by $1,000, what happens to enrollments? Of course, the consequence to the net tuition of those two policies is the same. And he did find that whether we reduce the sticker price or we increase the aid, you did get positive effects on enrollment. But interestingly, decreasing the sticker price mattered more. Now, this doesn't make any sense from a standard economic model because the net tuition is not changing as we think about these two alternatives. Decrease the sticker price, or for a Pell eligible student, will just increase the aid by the same amount. You got the same net fee change. It's a reduction of $1,000. But these families are more responsive to the sticker price, probably because they don't fully understand the connection between the sticker price and their reality. And it underscores just the incredible power of that sticker price. Now, can we just go to free tuition across the board? Yeah, probably not, at least not the way the American education is set up. Our system requires tuition revenue. But as we try to thread this needle of charging some students higher fees than other students, we have to think about the messaging. And can we message in a way that's more transparent for students that are on the lower income side? And the Go Blue guarantee is trying to cut through that noise by using that word free. If you're a low income family, tuition won't be low. It's not going to be discounted. It's not that you're going to be eligible for aid. It's going to be free tuition, zero. Hope College is trying something similar, but maybe more widespread with their Hope Forward program. So their idea is to try to change the funding mechanism entirely. Rather than having students on the front end pay, they're experimenting with having students come who don't pay anything. They tell them, you just get to come for free. And on the tail end, based on the success in your life after Hope, we will hope that you will pay that forward by paying for the next generation. Again, the interesting word here is free. So we've got a number of different ways that we can think about how we message around financial aid and package financial aid for that matter, so that we can cut through the noise and make it clear to low-income families that they can indeed afford what we're offering. We can also think about some other connections to financial aid, thinking about how financial aid can be used as a lever to encourage students to engage in high impact activities. I think about DePaul's guarantee for their students, where if they don't have a job or a graduate school placement within 6 months after graduation, they can go back to DePaul for another term for free. It's a really flamboyant offer, but the reality is that most of their students are doing well. They do get placed. And importantly, the guarantee is conditional on students doing a certain set of practices, things like engaging in the same high impact practices that we know encourage student success. And so they're having this sort of financial aid offer on the table as a carrot to get students to do the things that we all know do promote student success and mean that very, very infrequently will the institution have to make good on that promise. So if the number of new students is declining at a rate that makes it difficult to imagine that the admissions office is going to solve its problem just by recruiting harder with new students, where else might we look? Well, first we might think about transfer students. The caution here is, as we talk about this, let's recognize that one institution's win may be another's loss. It's not always. Sometimes a student would simply stop out. And so if we have a transfer, that might be a better outcome. But if we're thinking just about transfer students as the solution to our problem, well, we're competing then perhaps with another institution that's losing those students. And as the market gets tighter, they might be trying to retain those students more aggressively. That might make this channel harder. But we still do have some pretty compelling data. The National Clearinghouse and the NCES suggest that 80% of two-year students, as they start, say that they intend to get a four-year degree. So the bachelor's degree is their intention as they start for 80% of two-year students, but only 30% transfer to a four-year institution. So we've got about 50% of students who start out on a two-year program who say they intend to get a bachelor's, but they never even make it to the four-year institution. And only 13% will earn a bachelor's degree within 6 years of when they started that two-year institution. So clearly we have leaky pipelines. Clearly we have students who are not fulfilling what they say is their intent. And so it means that maybe we've got some promising opportunities. So I highlight here the work of the Council of Independent Colleges and the independent colleges specifically in North Carolina that partnered with two-year institutions in the state, hammering out not just articulation agreements about credits, but specific major-based articulation agreements. So the student knows if I take this specific class, it's not this that I'll get credits to transfer, but I will get credits that transfer in a way that knock out major requirements, say in my nursing program, so that it's not a 2 and 2 that turns into a 2 and 4, and far from saving the student any money, actually costs them more, but is actually a successful path. So obviously, as we step into the transfer students, we can think about just recruiting harder, but we also might want to be thinking about partnering and how we can engage with other institutions around us if we're to, bolster our enrollments, not just by new enrollments, but by thinking about the transfers.
Yeah. So it sounds like we have the recruitment and getting students in the door still a part of the solution. Sounds like financial aid, better messaging, all that still helps on the new side. But where else can we productively look to help increase enrollment as the landscape continues to get more challenging?
Yeah, so if the front door, in essence, is going to be a challenging place to work, an important place to work, but not enough, we have to start thinking about the back door. And that brings us to the attention to student success. And this can look like a lot of different things. There are three legs, if you will, on the retention stool. We've got belonging, academic preparation, and then financial components. So for instance, two-thirds of Gen Z um, have experienced a delinquency, which is about twice the rate of millennials, and they do carry lots of debt. And maybe as a consequence of that, or maybe it's a paradox, they say they don't want any debt. So there's more debt sensitivity among these students, and so that brings greater attention to the financial side of the retention tool. But we can think about this retention problem from all the sides. So for instance, St. Cloud State University put together a 10-question instrument, a simple survey instrument, that they could give just a few weeks when first-year students stepped foot on their campus that would well predict those students who had a 3.0 or better in fall term, but still had an alarming attrition rate into spring term. So they were losing something like 20% of these students who were making it just fine in the classroom. And in particular, what they're surveying for here is a sense of belonging and connection to the campus. So they had a battery of questions that came from a fee-based survey suite. And so a statistics class actually took this on as a class project, trying to identify which of the questions in these surveys were best predictors of stopping out. And based on that work, they were able to refine it down to just 10 quick questions. And so they're able to better identify really early on which students are already at risk because they don't feel connected to the institution. And then how can we get that information in the hands of faculty members and staff members who might be connected to this student to try to draw them into campus and get them socially connected. At the University of Southern Maine, this looks like just a detailed, hardcore effort on student advising, really leaning into that academic preparation side. At other institutions, it does look like attending to the financial aid side. But whichever part of the stool we're looking at, there are ways that we might improve retention and as a result, not need to attract as many students. And here too, we can see the importance of reaching out to the rest of campus. Sometimes enrollment management includes both the admissions function and the retention function. In that case, at least you have admissions folks sitting next to the student success folks, or maybe that's one and the same person at some level of the institution. But even so, how does the enrollment management office accomplish all of this? And the answer has to be increasingly that we find partnerships with faculty and staff who are not in the enrollment management function. Thinking about what St. Cloud State was doing there, obviously you're identifying students at risk of dropping out because of belonging. Clearly, engaging the faculty members who are in the classroom with those students is a critical component of that. At the University of Southern Maine, it means getting into the advising function. Let's help students identify learning disabilities before they get a bad grade on an exam, for instance. And so we have to build those networks and those bridges from the enrollment management part of the campus that has retention within its purview to the rest of campus. Another aspect of student success might be mental health, and here there might be roles for collaboration. So I've seen two collaborations that I thought were pretty interesting. In this case, DePauw, Rose-Hulman, and St. Mary's of the Woods are collaborating because of geographical proximity. All three recognized that they did not have as much support for students around mental health as would be ideal, but all three also recognized that their scales were really small. And so they really couldn't afford individually to bring on a director of a mental health program that would be sufficient for the challenges that they had. But because they're close to one another, they realized if they worked together, they might be able to hire such a person and put together a program that transcended the campuses. And then by working together, they could do better for their students. And obviously, that's what we're ultimately about, is serving our students better. And it has a good payoff to the campus bottom line as well by improving retention. And so thinking about collaborating in that way, another mental health collaboration was in the Kansas City area where a 2-year institution, a 4-year institution, and a graduate school of nursing all collaborated together. They were sort of stacked. They recognized that they were feeder schools, one to the next. And the challenge was that they recognized that as students made that transfer from the 2-year to the 4-year, from the 4-year to the health services school, they were losing some students because mental health support was being disrupted. So I would see a mental health care professional connected to the first institution, and then I would transfer, and now I need to make a connection with another mental health professional. And they realized, for those of us who struggle with mental health in one way or another, it's really hard to make a connection with a mental health care provider. And when you have a good connection, it really sets you back to have to change up your providers. And so what they did was to bring the mental health under a single umbrella. So as the students transferred from one institution to the next, they could maintain the same relationship with their mental health care provider. So interesting ways to think about how collaboration around mental health might serve a student success goal. I think one of the challenges that I've been thinking about as we think about this three-legged stool of student success is that the reality might be more complicated than A plus B plus C. We often talk about it that way. Well, we've got an initiative and it's focused on belonging. And another institution has an initiative that's focused on finances. The ASAP program at CUNY raises the possibility that we have a multiplicative model. It's A times B times C. So if I solve the belonging issue, but I don't relax the issue of academic support, I still lose the student. If I solve the academic support, but I haven't solved the financial problem, I still lose the student. And as a consequence, perhaps what we need to do to be truly effective, as with the ASAP program, is a wraparound program that addresses all three parts of that retention stool at once. The downside here is it's really expensive to do that, obviously. I mean, there's a reason that we work in a more piecemeal fashion. I might be able to find enough resources to come out with a new advising program, but where do I find the resources to simultaneously address student belonging? But if the model is multiplicative, it might be that we're just wasting resources largely by focusing on one leg of the stool to the exclusion of the other two. We saw, for instance, in ASAP that while the program was very expensive on the front end on a per student basis, if you look at a per degree granted basis, the cost actually went down. So they were plowing something like $6,000 per student into the ASAP wraparound program. So expensive. But because their success rate, their degree attainment rate, was about 1/4 when they started, and it rose to about 1/2 when they were done, well, that's an enormous gain. And so if you thought about it on a per degree basis, the cost actually went down. This is obviously a challenge politically, whether we're in a public institution or a private institution. Is it possible to get support for a wraparound program that requires a financial big push on the part of the institution? In some cases, the answer may be no, and then you have no choice but to go in the piecemeal fashion and try to figure out which of the three bottlenecks is most acute right now, and let's try to relax that, and then we'll figure out after we've done this initiative what the next initiative needs to be. But we are seeing a large number of states, at least in the public system, taking on this ASAP model and trying to do the big push. I think on one hand, it's really daunting when I think about the cost that they're talking about per student. But on the flip side, when you're talking about literally doubling the student success rate from 25 to 50%, there's something really appealing to think about that. And now we get into the even more challenging part. So we talked about admissions, then we talked about retention. Some campuses, those are under the same umbrella. But it's difficult for me to believe that we are going to improve retention and we're going to expand recruitment, but we're going to leave the academic side of the college entirely untouched. That just doesn't seem, I think we do see instances of that in our past, and they don't go very well. We bring students to campus, and then they find that the campus isn't well aligned for them to succeed. And pretty soon the entire community that we were trying to reach out into says, "Yeah, we've seen this before. We've had, friends and family attend your institution, and it doesn't go well for them." So we're probably going to have to think about what's going on in the academic programming, and here we have, real bridge building required. So for instance, we know from Gates Foundation research that students come to college as an investment. We can see here the reason to get a college degree, 70, 80% are saying, I want to get a job that helps me make more money, get a promotion, get training for a specific career, to have more job security. So families and students view higher ed as an investment. And we can see that there's a big payoff. So Gallup and Strata have done a lot of good work. Here they're looking at two different outcomes. One is, I strongly agree that my education was worth the cost. And the second was, I strongly agree that I received a high quality education. And what they've done here is to show the correlation between those responses and the relevance that you saw between the work you were doing in your classroom and your life after college. And the bottom line is, when students see a connection between what they were doing at college and what they did after college, when they see that connection, they feel that resonance, that relevance rather, they're likely to agree both that the cost was worth it and they got a high quality education. And if they don't see that connection, they do not perceive their education positively in these ways. So it seems like one way or another, we're going to have to think about, how do we help students see the connections between what they're doing on our college campuses and the lives that they desire after. I heard at Hope College, one colleague refer to this as the work of translation. That we can see the relevance, but our students can't necessarily see that. And can we help them with this translation work of seeing how what they're doing in the classroom translates to life after? And I just want to underscore that this is, when I say the word relevance, sometimes my colleagues in the humanities, develop a tick. It feels like, okay, so are you demeaning the humanities? Does this mean that everybody has to be a STEM major? And the answer is no. So a couple examples. At Lewis University, we have examples of leaning into this relevance by computer science plus X. So computer science plus anthropology, computer science plus music, as a way to beef up the hard skills, if you will, of students who are in some of these majors that are maybe perceived as less connected to the workplace. Now, when we say that, it sounds like there that, okay, so does that mean that the music or the anthropology can't stand on its own? At Endicott, we have a model sort of like at Northeastern with co-ops. So deep internships for all students, regardless of major, underscoring that this isn't just something for STEM students. Obviously, STEM students have needs for internships and an opportunity to think about how their skills play out of the workplace. But all students at Endicott are encouraged or required to take part in those kinds of internships. At Scripps College, just to underscore the capacity for the humanities to engage in this in uniquely humanistic ways, they've got capstone experiences for the humanities students, where students are invited to think about real-world problems like homelessness and environmental degradation and contemplate humanistic solutions to those problems as a way at the end of their time at college to step back and have a moment to think about how is it that what you have learned in studying literature, studying history, or studying world religions puts you in a place where you are empowered to think about new solutions to the world's problems. Finally, we might see more system collaboration. So especially when we think about public institutions, we've seen experiments in different ways here. So for instance, in the University of Maine system, they've gone to joint accreditation. So we have separate public institutions in the state of Maine. They have separate leadership, but at the same time, they are accredited jointly, which reflects the fact that they're thinking collaboratively about things like where do we offer particular major programs? How might we take students who are at one institution and tap into course offerings at another institution for these students to bolster what they're doing on their campus? At UMass, it's collaboration thinking about on the recruitment side. Can we do better to redirect students who apply to one institution and are waitlisted or denied, rather than just having that be an end? Can it instead be the start of a conversation at another institution in our system? In Georgia, of course, they're doing collaboration through combining institutions with consolidation. As I think about all of these things going on in the public sphere, it makes me wonder whether or not the privates aren't lagging behind. So for instance, could you imagine private institutions collaborating in the way that UMass is talking about their independent institutions collaborating, where an institution that says, no, we don't have space for you in our class, rather than just saying no, might say, but we do have a partner institution and we can help you think about how it might work if you were to transfer this application over to those institutions. So maybe we need to think more about how we work together, even as I think we're headed toward an environment where we are going to be highly competitive with one another. So maybe we have to get used to on Monday, we are fierce competitors, but on Tuesday, we're thinking about how we can collaborate on mental health, how we can collaborate on admissions, and so on. And I think we are seeing more activity like that with some institutions, for instance, in the private liberal arts sphere, organizing college fairs, because while we are in competition with one another, we share a joint need to communicate what are the liberal arts and what students might be a good fit at our institutions, whether it's, say, Carleton in my case, or Swarthmore, or Williams, or Lewis and Clark. Yes, we are competitors in one sense, but we share something in common. So I want to, as we head toward questions, and you can again be submitting the questions through the online option there. Just want to leave us with a positive metaphor. So we've talked about some real challenges, and even as we talk about ways forward, I know a lot of these ways forward boil down to some serious disruption on our campuses. Ed Bennett at EAB wrote a blog post pointing to Talib's book Anti-Fragile that reminds us that when we are put under stress, there are actually three responses. Fragility we know is bad, just breaking, that's not what we want. Sometimes we immediately go to just robustness. I want to get through this stress unchanged. The anti-fragile system, however, is I think where we need to be thinking more, spending more of our time thinking. As we experience these stresses of declining numbers of young people, recently at least we've seen declines in matriculation rates. As we think about challenges to find the higher education business model, can we view these as an opportunity to be an anti-fragile system where because of the stress we get stronger? Like someone stepping onto a treadmill doesn't look to get through the stress of the treadmill and remain unchanged. Far from it. The whole point is to subject yourself to the stress so that you can become stronger. Stronger muscle system, stronger skeletal system, stronger cardiovascular system. I certainly wouldn't choose some of the stresses that we're experiencing today in higher ed, but can we view the experience through this anti-fragile lens? Can we think about how we can expand our work of access, that we reach new student groups? Can we think about how we can better fulfill our missions regarding student success? Can we think about how we can collaborate more effectively so that we steward our resources to a greater degree with peers and so on, so that we come out the other side, say at 2045, not looking back and saying this was easy, but perhaps saying that we are glad for the work that we did. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up and look forward to the questions.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Grawe. Yeah, I hear you. I think all of our lives have become way more challenging, and as a senior enrollment leader, I miss those days if I could buy a list of names on one end, and I could predict with a high level of certainty how many students were going to come out in our class on the back end. Now, there is no more apples to apples comparison, and
Right.
I love the encouragement to collaborate. These are oftentimes lonely roles because you don't know how you're doing in your own institution relative to others, and the stress has always made us stronger, which is why getting together, even in forums like this, is always wonderful.
Yeah,
Um,
we had stress. We haven't even said AI yet today, so
yeah,
see if it
well,
comes up in the questions. But
well, let's start heading there. You might hear that come up. So, first question for you: there's this the population in the South of students continues to increase, which is fortunate for them, and unlike
yeah.
in other places. But how long do you think that lasts? And how much do you think the South, in particular, maybe has to balance this idea of uh, pro- their enrollment is increasing, but the need to also balance that with going after that some college, no degree, non-traditional student?
Yeah, so I think that geographic component is really interesting. Yeah, I don't know that it will last forever. Obviously, they're being buoyed by some migration patterns that may hold up. Though we're seeing, some housing markets in Texas and Florida, for instance, are getting more expensive. Some of the move out of the West Coast, for instance, we know, and the Northeast as well, is motivated by the expense of housing a young family. And so we see young families moving away from those high housing cost areas. Well, as that trend has continued, we've seen housing prices in other parts of the country that they've traditionally moved to respond by increasing as well. So maybe there's a limit to how far this can go. And ultimately, we'll see. It's not clear that we've hit a bottom yet on fertility. If it keeps trending down, eventually it seems inevitable that even these stronger parts of the country are going to experience some of the declines that the rest of us have experienced. I mean, it's a little bit like the Northeast has been in decline for a while the Mountain West has been rising. But, the decline in 2007 is going to catch up, it seems, to the Mountain West. And so some of those institutions are going to join their Northeast colleagues in grappling with smaller cohorts. So it does seem like at some point these institutions in the South and the Southwest are going to have to deal with these things, but that time is not now. What they will have to deal with increasingly now is increased competition from others.
Yep.
So institutions that have a national reach have been placing admissions officers, for instance, in Texas and Houston, at a very, very high rate. And so you see the Texas institutions definitely have a leg up. Something like 80% of students choose to study in their home state. So there's no doubt that it is a privileged position in the current environment to be located in some of these stronger, but I think there is a risk in thinking, oh, so I've got nothing to worry about here, as
Mhm.
if the rest of the world is just going to take their lumps and not start horning in on those markets, and increasing competition. So I think, the same thing can be said of more selective institutions, where it seems like the compositional shifts demographically favor that part of the market, so they don't have to worry quite as much
Yeah.
about declining numbers of people who are interested in that market. But then again, we have to recognize that as the rest of the market gets awfully hungry and competitive, um, those of us who are in this more selective area should be thankful that we have a stronger market, but we should not be resting on our laurels. We need to be continually thinking about how can we make good on our promises, because competition will become more fierce.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember being an admissions counselor in Texas and at a Big 12 institution, and we had the Houston area recruiting network and the Dallas area recruiting network, Harn and Darn. And it used to be just our Texas schools, and then all of a sudden the next year was the Texas schools plus the Southeastern Conference schools, and that definitely saw a growth in competition in that area. So thank you for that. Another question here: gender. Thoughts on how gender composition of first time full time has changed as we watch the female to male ratio widen over the years?
Yeah, it's really curious to me because that trend has been so long standing. I mean, we can go back to the 70s. Now, then we were starting with the ratio flipped, and so the trend was towards equality. But it's been a long time now since we reached gender parity and went into a space where females outnumbered males. And yes, it has widened. It seems like in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been more willingness or interest in talking about that disparity. And I think institutions that can figure out how to address that are obviously going to be advantaged in this environment of declining numbers of young people. If we could level up Obviously, leveling down, having women attend at the same rates that men attend would be devastating. But if we could level up so that the gap between men and women were, say, halved, with male matriculation rates rising, that would go a long way, if not all the way, to addressing the problems that we have in declining numbers of young people. I mean, men make up roughly half of the population. So it's, if we could have that gap, that would go a long way. The kinds of things that we hear people trying are, thinking about affinity groups that are more interesting to men, whether that's thinking about having sports on campus because men want to play sports or because they want to be part of a campus environment where they observe sports. Some campuses have added ROTC. Um, I think probably if we're going to address this, we're going to have to think a little bit more fundamentally. It feels a little bit to me like the issue of recruiting groups that have been racial or ethnic minorities on our campus in the past. As we bring a small number of those students to campus, if we don't change what the campus functioning looks like, those students pretty quickly pick up on like, oh, okay, you said you wanted us here, but then when we got here, didn't really feel like you were willing to do anything to change the institution to feel like home to us. And so it feels to me like if we're going to address the female male gap, we're going to have to think pretty broadly in ways that involve a lot of the campus, and it's probably not just as easy as adding affinity groups.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Let's jump over to impacts on quality of education. In any of your research, the feeling is we're obviously having also cut expenses as tuition
Yeah.
revenue decreases. Does anything in any of your research talk about the quality of education as all these changes and shifts are happening?
So my research hasn't been on that, but I've been a consumer of that, and that is definitely a concern. In particular, it's not just that average quality will go down, but that we might have a bifurcation. So as I mentioned, the market for selective institutions seems to be holding up, even as the market overall is weakening. And so the worry would be that as institutions under pressure look to cut costs, we end up with these two models. Some small number of students who are at more selective institutions that are well resourced get a very high touch, high quality form of education, while a much, much larger group get, maybe it's, here maybe we get into the AI. We get these learning models that are facilitated by technology work quite as well, but they're just gobs cheaper. And, to be honest, if you had a highly motivated student, you might get a decent education out of it. But given that most people are average and not exceptional, most people get a subpar education out of it. And so this worry of this growing haves and have-nots, where we get this small subset that gets a really, really high quality education, and then a larger mass of people who increasingly get a compromised education. And I do worry about that. I think there will be ways that solve our budget problems just by budget cutting. And some of that, I suppose, there are no doubt things that we do at Carleton and elsewhere that we don't need to do. So, okay, yes, absolutely. Let's look at our budgets and find fat and get rid of it. But at some point, we're not cutting fat, we're cutting muscle. And there's a real concern in this time that some institutions will find their way forward in ways that compromise the quality. So I think that's real both for the average level, but also what it does to the distribution.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've heard a number of even the panelists on this or the attendees in this call. I've heard them say out loud, "You can't cut your way to growth," right? And that's always
Exactly.
a challenge.
Yeah, and there are
Um,
some things that you can cut and you can retain students, but there are other things where you just initiate a death spiral and it's cut one thing, lose students who notice, and then cut another thing and lose some more students. So yeah, it's yes, definitely steward our money well, but we have to be thinking more positively than that, I think.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's address the AI question head on.
Okay.
And I'm going to phrase this in a way that kind of marries or touches a little bit on the academic quality piece. There's this concern that parents, we go into this idea, and you touched on this, that we go this for a better outcome, a
Okay.
better life, a better career. And now we have these institutions that are launching AI focused majors. Yet AI is moving so fast that we how do we adapt to this? For example, I have my son's friends are computer science majors, and they feel like majority of what they learned
Yeah.
over the past 4 years is almost outdated. How do we create this track students and families with a high level of confidence and ROI of higher education with this idea that AI is the way of the future?
Yeah. So the way I've been thinking about it with my students is to emphasize that AI is going to have, as many technologies do, two very different effects on different tasks and skills. So when we think about technological advance, um, that displaces the need, it reduces the amount of human input that's necessary. Um, think about what happened with farming, for instance. In the last 150 years, we've dramatically increased productivity by use of technology. And the number of farmers has dropped dramatically. And I think that's the picture most people have in mind. Um, I think we have to recognize part of what's going on there is as the cost of calories has gone down, while I just saw a graph that shows we do consume more calories today than we did 100 years ago as Americans. And I guess you can see it in my spare tire, or you can see it in the fact that I have to go to the gym and burn all these calories to take care of all the excess eating I'm doing. But the bottom line is we didn't increase consumption of food that much. Prices went down, and we said, great, I'll take lower prices and I'll consume a little bit more. But as a consequence, that means that that labor-saving technology just meant we don't need as much food, we don't need as many workers. Contrast that to say what happened with spreadsheets. Spreadsheets allowed us to do all sorts of quantitative analysis much more effectively with less human effort. Did that lead to a decline in the number of people working with quantitative modeling or quantitative thinking? No, quite the reverse. Instead, as the price went down, people said, oh my gosh, this stuff is awesome. And if the price is lower, I'm going to consume a whole lot more of it. And so, because there was so much more consumption of financial analysis, quantitative analysis, the number of jobs working in those kinds of things actually went up. And so when we think about AI, I think there are going to be some subsets like, well, maybe like coding, where the labor savings is just so great that we say, okay, we don't need as many coders because I'm not going to increase my coding demand. I'm just going to say, hey, this is I'll get a little bit more coding, but basically this is just cheaper. Thank you. But there are going to be other things where AI just gives an opportunity where people will say, wow, okay, this just became cheaper. I in the past wouldn't have done it, or I would have only done a little bit, but if it's going to be cheap, let's do a lot of it. And so working with our students to think about where are the places where the tool can complement human activity, that's where I want to be positioning myself. So, for instance, for me, I used to be regarded well, say, on church committees and otherwise, because I could crank out text. I'm guessing a lot of people listening are the same kind of people. Like, oh my gosh, you just cranked out 2 pages of text. Nobody cares anymore, right? A bot can crank out 2 pages of text quickly. So that skill has not got the same value it used to. But the thought skill of asking the questions, that skill just got a lot more powerful because the bot can carry out those ideas so much faster. And so we need to position ourselves and think about how we can help our students position themselves by being the thinkers who use the bot rather than the worker who's got a narrow skill base that that is competing with the bot. I certainly don't want to be in competition with the bot. That sounds like a tough place right now.
Yeah, amen to that. All right, time for one more. This one about the international students. With the change in some of the administration and the challenges of coming here, we are seeing more and more institutions go online and or open up campuses in other countries. Sometimes even with tuition discounts to make that education affordable. Do you think this will either help attract more students from other countries to come here to the US? Or do you think really it's just these institutions that are thinking more enterprisingly about going into those? Do they become winners and those that are not doing that here in the US just kind of be losers?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Interesting part because when we think about who the market is of international students, a lot of the reason that international student enrollments has been on the rise is because we've seen rapid increase in income, so both average income in places like China and Korea and India, but also rise in inequality, right? There are people who have a lot of resources. Those families are not likely to say, that they would like to send their students via online because these are high willingness to pay families who are looking for the experience. But on the flip side, you've got people in India and China who are richer because of development, but they aren't in the far right tail. They don't have gobs of money, and so they can't afford to buy the experience of being in person. And so it is an interesting question of, okay, so if we expand into those online frameworks for international students, is that something that international families are going to want, or are they going to say, no, I mean, it's either the full product or I'm just not interested. So I don't know is the answer, but I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, that'll be a we will see, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Well, Dr. Grawe, thank you again so much for joining us. Everyone, thank you for being a part of this webinar. For the 2 or 3 questions that I didn't get to, I will make sure we answer those and send those out as a part of our follow-ups, along with the recording to everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a wonderful, happy holidays and Happy New Year. Take care. Bye-bye.